Next, from Chicago, Andrea Zopp, the former president and CEO of the Chicago Urban League, gives an address at the City Club of Chicago about her campaign for U.S. Senate. This runs about 25 minutes.
I'd like to thank the City Club of Chicago for the opportunity to speak to you today. But I do want to just, and one of the things I love about the City Club is that they bring diverse voices to come and talk about the issues that are important to our city. But I do just want to note, I've spoken at the City Club before, and I do just want to make sure that you know that it is way more challenging for the women who have to speak here than the guys. Let's face it, guys, what do you got to do? You got to worry about, am I wearing the tie with the cartoon characters or the fuzzy animals? We have to worry about the color. Is this the color that makes me look white? Is this the jacket that flaps around too much? It's very stressful. And we also, women have to get through, and every mother's room who has kids over the age of 10 knows what I'm about to say. We have to get through the child gauntlet. So here's what happens. You wake up in the morning, you're like, you know you had a big day, maybe you have a big speech to deliver, you get up, you're like, what will I wear? You put it on, you're like, I look great, I'm ready. You do your Wonder Woman stance, power stance. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, you can Google that after my speech. It's a great TED Talk. So you do your Wonder Woman power stance, you're great. You go downstairs to the kitchen, your child's down there having their cereal, one of your kids, they look at you, they give you the look. You're wearing that? All the power, gone, boom. Fortunately for me today, I made it through the gauntlet of the Zopp children and approved the outfit. And I'm really thrilled to be here with you today. I want to thank everyone for coming. I especially want to thank my husband of 26 years, Bill Zopp, and my kids, Kelsey and Will, for being here. Today, I want to talk to you about leadership, or more importantly, the devastating impact of the lack of leadership on the part of too many of our elected and government officials. The absence of the will to drive change, the default to gridlock, is becoming so invasive in our government as to become an epidemic of inaction. And here's the problem, though. The people getting sick from this epidemic, getting hurt, feeling the pain, are not the government and elected officials who have the illness, but the people they are supposed to serve. Like the people of Flint, Michigan, sickened with lead poisoning because their officials let cost-cutting, bureaucracy, and passing the buck get in the way of providing safe, clean drinking water. Like so many in our own state who have lost access to after-school programs, daycare, job training, disability services, addiction and mental health treatment, and very soon students, mostly black and brown, who will lose their access to public colleges and the educations they have fought so hard for because our governor has chosen ideological warfare over governing. Like Laquan McDonald, denied justice for an incomprehensible 13 months. When our leaders do not come from the communities impacted by this epidemic of inaction, when they have not worked and fought for change, when their only visit to the communities impacted are to have press conferences and press events, it is easy for them to forget about those who are feeling the pain, to forget about communities that need investment, to forget about those who need to support to work to climb out of poverty, and to forget about those black and brown youth who are the victims of police abuse. We need leadership that is grounded in experience, leadership that understands, hears, and represents the voices of those who are feeling the pain. It is time to end the epidemic of inaction and to move to action. And while our challenges are many, we can start with an issue that is at the forefront today in Chicago and across our country, the crisis of confidence in our law enforcement and criminal justice system. As the president and CEO of the Chicago Urban League, I wrote and spoke a number of times on the growing gulf between law enforcement and communities of color, driven by an increasing number of questionable deaths of African Americans at the hands of law enforcement, and in most instances, the seeming lack of accountability of the police for these deaths. As I reviewed my earlier commentaries, I was struck by the repetition. Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Walter Scott, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray, Rekia Boyd, Laquan McDonald, Cedric Chapman, Quintonio LaGreer, Betty Jones. And I have to admit, I had a moment A moment much like that President Barack Obama had when he was brought to tears recently, remembering all the times he had to meet with the families of victims of the senseless gun violence plaguing our country. Not a moment of defeat, but of despair at the loss and damage that has been done, and of uncertainty. Can we get this fixed? Can we turn this around? Can we repair the distrust that has been built between law enforcement and the community, restore faith in our system of justice, and rebuild on a foundation of transparency, accountability, cooperation, and collaboration? As I said, it was a moment that passed with the clear recognition that we can and we must drive fundamental change. I know that we can because as the granddaughter of a barber from Mississippi who was never able to exercise his constitutional right to vote, and the great-granddaughter of a man born into slavery, the fact that I am standing here today as a candidate for the United States Senate is a testament to the difficult challenges that we have already overcome. We must, because we cannot hope to end the scourge of gun violence, over 200 shootings in the first 21 days of 2016, that plague Chicago and communities across our state and country without cooperation, collaboration, and trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. We must, because the incidents of excessive and deadly force by law enforcement in their dealings with people of color and the subsequent inability of our criminal justice system to carry out justice has a devastating impact on communities and on our young people. This issue is personal to me. Law enforcement and our justice system have long been a part of my life. My mother was one of the first women on the police force in Rochester, New York, where I grew up. She didn't stay very long, but she broke a large barrier there. And my father was the first black judge on the bench in Rochester, elected in 1972. As you know, I spent many years as a prosecutor. My husband, Bill, who I've been, as I noted, been married to for 26 years, my husband Bill was a DEA agent served in law enforcement for over 30 years. And our daughter is on the pathway to become a Chicago police officer. I have a tremendous amount of respect for and belief in our justice system. I know personally how hard the job of our law enforcement officers is. But I am also a mother. Bill and I have 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. When Trayvon Martin was killed, our son Will came to us confused and angry. Will and Trayvon were born in the same year, 1995. Bill and I had to talk to our son about the challenges facing black men in America. We had to tell him that simply because of his race, he could be viewed as a threat, and that the rules for he and his black friends were not the same as those for his white friends. This was not a pleasant conversation, but it was necessary. And we've revisited this conversation more than once in our home. And just 2 months ago, things reached a fever pitch after that shocking dash cam video of Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke firing 16 bullets into teenager Laquan McDonald in an incident that did not require deadly force. After watching that horrific video, Will came back. He came to me upset and worried that his life had no value in the eyes of law enforcement. That is the message that our city and our county sent to our children after the video was finally released. An indictment was made 13 months after Laquan's death. The video of Laquan's shooting is disturbing not just because of the graphic nature and the tragedy it filmed, but because it shows us very clearly that our system of accountability is broken. We all asked ourselves, how could it possibly have taken over a year for our law enforcement and prosecution authorities to respond to that shooting? And as a former prosecutor, I can tell you there is no good answer to that question. It was frustrating enough when the incidents were occurring in other parts of the country, but now all eyes are on Chicago. The world is watching, and justice demands that we do something to restore community and police relations and make certain that law enforcement and the justice system works for all, not just a select few. And we must restore hope in our young people, many of whom already face tremendous challenges. Just yesterday, the Chicago Urban League held a forum on youth unemployment. Many of you saw those statistics. And by the way, those statistics, unfortunately, are not new, but they are shocking. 50%, just about 50% of young African-American men are what we are called disconnected in this city. That means without a job, not in school. 50%, and the numbers for Hispanics are not much better. One of the things I fought hard to do when I was working in the criminal justice system was to fight to make sure that the system worked for everybody, regardless of their age, race, gender, and sexual orientation or economic status. And that includes making sure that when people cross the line, be it prosecutors or police officers, that they're held accountable. When I was the first assistant state's attorney, I indicted Officer Gregory Becker, a Chicago police officer, for shooting an unarmed homeless man named Joseph Gold and leaving him for dead on the street. It was a tough, Officer Becker was subsequently convicted and sent to prison. It was a tough case. We didn't have many witnesses, and we didn't have a videotape. But it didn't take me 13 months. It took me under 60 days. The important thing here is to remember is that holding people, law enforcement, accountable is doable. It's tough, but it's doable. And here's the other reason why it's important. Prosecutors and police have a tremendous amount of discretion and authority. When I was a prosecutor, I could get someone to either come to court or produce their materials simply by going and filling out a piece of paper called a subpoena, taking that piece of paper and handing it to a law enforcement officer and saying, go serve it. And then that individual, any individual in this county, had to respond. That's a tremendous amount of authority. And with that authority comes great responsibility. And the police have great authority to make life and death decisions. And we give them that authority under the assumption that they're going to do their jobs fairly on behalf of the citizens they are sworn to protect. And when that does not happen, we expect that they will be held accountable. That is how our system should work. And when it operates at its best, our American justice system is most impressive. But it must operate fairly, and the community must believe that it is operating fairly. But when that expectation of fairness is undercut without an adequate response, it chips away at the foundation of our Constitution. That is why this issue is so important, and that is why we are all so frustrated. This crisis of confidence that we must address was not 13 months in the making. It has been years, if not decades, in the making. Disinvestment in our most troubled neighborhoods, a criminal justice and drug deterrence policy that placed over-reliance on incarceration and blurred the line between child and adult, building the school-to-prison pipeline, and the entrenchment of the culture of protect your own within law enforcement. Also, the deep racial barriers that continue to divide us all are contributing factors. Chicago is at a tipping point, and how we respond to this crisis will have an impact that will be felt for decades. And it won't be felt just on the south and west sides. It will be felt all over our city and will resonate statewide. Recent actions show that we are moving in the right direction. The resignation of Gary McCarthy has given us the opportunity to have new leadership of the Chicago Police Department. And it is critically important that the community be engaged in that process. I was thrilled to hear that Charles Ramsey, my friend and former colleague who I worked closely with during my days at the State's Attorney's Office, will consult with the Chicago Police Department to help ensure that culture change occurs. And here's one thing you know about Chuck Ramsey, just so you know. Chuck Ramsey invited DOJ to come in and invest and look at both police departments he served as the head of. He didn't wait for a crisis. He didn't wait for bad things to happen. He said, I know we have a problem. I'm not going to wait for something bad to happen. Come look. I will take whatever you have to say, and I will then drive change. So we are very lucky to have him back here, helping to lead that change here. As one of the earliest voices calling for a DOJ investigation into our Chicago Police Department, I am thrilled that they are here and that investigation is underway. And when that work is done, as well as the work of the task force appointed by Mayor Emanuel, we must hold the city and the police department accountable to enact those recommendations. But that is not enough. Since November, I've called for a special prosecutor to be appointed in Officer Van Dyke's case. I am unconvinced, as is the community, that the current state's attorney is capable of mounting a vigorous, uncompromised prosecution in that case. But even if there is a special prosecutor in the Van Dyke case, there is more that needs to be done to restore faith in law enforcement and the criminal justice system. Improving community and police relations is something that I have been passionate about and worked on for decades. It is also a key part of my agenda for my campaign for the United States Senate. On November 4th, I released my community policing policy. As your next senator, I will advocate for funding a national equality and justice network that brings together groups who fight for equality to create a meaningful dialogue and a real plan of action to incidents of unfair treatment by individuals by authorities. We need to bring every group that has historically been marginalized to the table and work on joint solutions. I will support legislation that bans racial profiling. I believe that any law enforcement agency that receives Department of Justice funding must be required to ban racial profiling in all contexts, including street-level crime, school disciplinary actions, and immigration law enforcement. To increase transparency and accountability, states should be required to report to the Attorney General. Look, we all know, we're all business people, right? What gets measured gets done. All right? So states' attorneys should be required to report information regarding shooting incidents involving law enforcement officers, tracking civilian as well as officer deaths, and publicly report annual statistics on these deaths. To inform future policy, there should be a requirement to report data from law enforcement, such as the nature of stop, arrest rates, and demographic information. I believe the DOJ should provide funding for increased police training on ethnic and racial bias and cultural diversity, and police interaction with the disabled and mentally ill and new immigrants, as well as funding for body cameras. And finally, I'm in support of prohibiting the Department of Defense from transferring or selling excess property to state and local police forces. We do not need to militarize our local police. Now you may be thinking, where will you get all the money for that, Andy? Well, I'm glad you asked. The U.S. incarcerates more individuals than any other industrialized nation in the world, yet we're not safer. I believe if we reduce the nonviolent prison population, we can pay for these critical investments in our communities. It won't be easy, but it can be done. And while I know that it will take a tremendous amount of work to make these changes on a federal level and bring them to cities like Chicago, we can no longer afford to ignore the problem or its impact all over our city. In closing, I'd like to make 2 points. First, as I noted earlier, the roots of the divide between law enforcement and communities of color are embedded in the racial issues that often separate us. We cannot move forward if we do not understand where we have been. Or as philosopher George Santayana noted, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Equally important is to recognize that the past, like the view from your car's rearview mirror, is a lot closer than it appears. My parents lived in the Jim Crow South and went to segregated schools. My father fought in World War II in a segregated U.S. Army. And when he came home, it was dangerous for him to be seen on the streets in his uniform. On the September Sunday in 1963, when the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed in Birmingham, Alabama, and 4 young black girls attending Sunday school were killed, I was 6 and attending Sunday school at Memorial AME Zion Church in Rochester in my patent leather shoes and my frilly little anklets. In 1974, my freshman year at Harvard College, Boston was integrating its schools. And there were angry white mobs in downtown Boston stoning the buses that were carrying black students to their new schools. Many of our current public, civic, and business leaders grew up in a country where discrimination was legal and African Americans were second-class citizens. Or they lived and developed their values in neighborhoods like Levittown, a lovely community on Long Island that offered a pathway to homeownership and the middle class, but only to white families. In order to address the tough challenges facing us, we must honestly recognize the unconscious biases we all bring to the table. The past impacts the present. We are foolish if we do not hear the whispers of the lynch mob in policy calls like the one to ban all Muslims from entering our country. Lastly, voters are tired of elected officials who put politics before people. They are tired of politicians who announce an agenda or actions that make interesting political theater, but do nothing to drive positive change in the lives of everyday people. They are tired of politicians whose focus is on who got the most media impressions, or made the snappiest comeback, or the snarkiest tweet, not on creating real economic opportunity. Voters want elected officials who reflect their diversity, experience, and perspective. Like the tradesman who has earned the pay and benefits negotiated by his union with his sweat and hard work, and who wonders why his governor calls him and his union brethren corrupt. Or the young woman who seeks counseling on a difficult personal health decision, but has to be worried about being demonized as a murderer, and about her safety in even going to a clinic. Or the student who has worked hard to achieve academic success and get into college, but is facing his school year and his pathway to a degree being disrupted because his public college may close because our state can't get a budget. Or the small business owner who wants to grow her business in a challenged neighborhood, but can't get access to capital because of her zip code. Or the young man with the hoodie and the basketball who just wants a job opportunity and a chance not to be seen as a threat to his community. These voters want their perspective reflected by their elected officials. They want their voices and their stories heard. Their voices matter. As the next U.S. Senator from Illinois, I will keep my focus on people, not politics. I will work tirelessly to be an advocate for everyone in our state and to make criminal justice reform and improve relations between law enforcement and communities a key part of my agenda. I've been in the community working to drive change on matters that make a difference for working families for over 30 years. I know that moving forward from where we are today is possible, but I also know from experience that real change is real hard. This fact was recognized by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose birthday we just celebrated. Dr. King said, "Change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes only from continuous struggle. And so we must straighten our backs and work for our freedom." My back is straight. I'm ready to get to work. We all must be. The future of our great city, our state, and our country depend on it. Thank you.